So far, we've had a little play around with setting keys and moving things around in Blender, but we haven't focused on interpolation. When we animate our circle from point A to point B, those positions are our keyframes, and the interpolation is how it gets from point A to point B, the in-between bits. Now, we don't need to keyframe all the positions along the way. We're making the computer do that for us, but we can actually control the interpolation, or these positions, which is really the same thing. We do that in the graph editor, but that can be really confusing when you first start out. So what I want to do in this video is show you how to make sense of all this spaghetti by taming the graph editor. First, I'll show you everything you need to know, and then in the next couple of videos, we'll do some fun exercise to practice everything that we've learnt. Now for this example, I've already gone ahead and animated our monkey moving up and down, but we need to show you where the graph editor is. I'll just show you how we can actually create a new window. So I'm going to hover my mouse over any of these separators in between any of the windows. Then I'm going to right click and choose horizontal split. Now, if you happen to choose the wrong one, vertical split, you can actually just hit the tab key and that will change it. And that's quite handy. And we can actually drag this over any of our windows here. So it doesn't matter if we separated our window over here and then we wanted to actually split this window. So I'm just going to split it about here. And then I'm going to change this editor to be the graph editor. It is the one that has the little lines here. So I'm going to choose that. The shortcut is Shift F6. So we can hit Shift F6 in that window and it's going to change it to the graph editor, although it will toggle between the drivers and the graph editor because they're using the same one. Also, while we're here, I'll show you how to quickly change over to the dope sheet, which we won't be looking at in this video, but we will look at it later on, and that is by hitting Control Tab, and that's quickly going to jump over to our dope sheet or action editor, whichever one we had open last. But I'll go through that in a later video. So let's just Control Tab back to our graph editor. Now, what is this crazy spaghetti stuff going on? Well, the graph editor is just a visual representation of our changes on our channels over time. So if I play this, you can see our Z channel is going up and down. Now, you don't actually see the channel boxes update when you play the animation, but when you scrub, you will see these figures change. Let's have a look at our graph editor sections now. Now, the graph editor has several sections in it. The main area is the actual graph editor. Then up the top, we have the playhead area. On the left, we have all our groupings, and then on the right, which isn't open at the moment, we have our properties tab. We can open that by pressing the N key or just clicking that little arrow there. So the N key or the arrow will open that up. So they're the distinct areas of our graph editor. Now we can scrub inside our graph editor just along the top section here by left clicking and dragging. Although if you are right click select like I am, you can also left click and drag inside our main area. However, if you have the left click select, you just need to hold shift and then right click to drag in there. But as you already know, I prefer right click select. So the main functions that you use the graph editor for is to actually change the interpolation, as I said. So here you can see our monkey is just going up and down. So what if I want to actually change the position here without actually setting a keyframe? That's where our handles come in. Now we'll take a really good look in depth at the handles in a moment. But what we would do to adjust this is just grab our handle here with the G key and then move it around. And you see how our monkey is moving in the 3D viewport? We're changing its position without actually setting a keyframe. So now when we play our animation, you'll see it has changed. So the main functions that we do is move these keys around and manipulate our handles, as well as change our handle types. There's two menus that you'll use quite often in the graph editor, and that is the T menu to bring up our keyframe interpolation. That's the way I like to think about it, interpolation. Now we've got quite a big list here that we can change our keyframes here, and the only ones with handles on it are actually the Bezier ones. So we're going to focus on these three in the course, and these ones we're going to experiment a little bit later on. These are not really useful for character animation or things like that, but they are really great for motion graphics. But we'll have a little bit of an experimentation with those later on. Okay, so the three ones that we're focusing on today are the Bezier, the linear, and the constant. So that is the interpolation type menu, and the other menu is our vector handle type. It's actually the keyframe handle type, but I like to say V for vector because one of our options here is vector. So we can actually change our handle type and actually just change the way our interpolation works. So now when you play our animation, you see it hits the top and it bounces off. We can do the same thing here. I'll select those, hit V, change that to vector, and you'll see it's going in a linear fashion. Now, all the same operators that worked in our timeline also work inside our graph editor here. So we can translate with the shift middle mouse, we can zoom in and out with the control middle mouse and dragging it, and all these things are exactly the same as they are in all the animation editors. Now later in the course, we'll go through actually doing some proper animation with these keyframe handles. But for now, the only additional information I want you to be aware of is how to constrain it on our axes here. So in our 3D viewport, we have the 3 axes, but in our graph editor, we only have 2. So the horizontal axis is the x-axis and the vertical axis is the y-axis. So I wanted to move these keys and constrain them. I can hit G, and then if I want to constrain it horizontally, I can then push X, and that's going to constrain it horizontally, or I can press G and then Y to constrain it to the vertical axis. I can do that same thing with the mouse by hitting G, and then whatever direction I'm moving my mouse in, if I push the middle mouse as I'm doing that, it's going to constrain it in that axis. So if I go to the right and then hit the middle mouse, it's constraining it to the horizontal axis. I just right click to undo that. If I hit G and I'm moving my mouse in the vertical direction, and then hit the middle mouse, it's going to constrain it vertically. So that's all I want you to know for now. Like I said, in the next couple of videos, we'll be doing lots of animation with the graph editor. So if anything's not making sense right now, don't worry, when you actually get to start using this stuff, it'll all be very, very simple. Now, I don't need to go through all the different ways of selecting keys and manipulating them. You already know all of that from the previous tutorials, but I will show you a few new things as well as show you how handy the lasso select is in the graph editor. So if we just control click here, that is left click for me, but right click by default. And that's really handy if they're all skewed everywhere. We can go, oh, I want to grab this one, this one, this one, and I don't want to grab that, but I do want to grab this. You can create a nice selection quite easily there. That is where the lasso select excels. Let me just deselect everything now, and I'll show you the link select. So I can just select one key, or as many keys as I want, and then if I press L, it's going to select everything that was connected to that selection. That is a very handy way of selecting. Another handy way is to column select. So with this key selected, if I hit K, it's going to select all the keyframes on that column. So say if I want this one, this one, this one, and I want all of the keys, I select all of them and then hit K, and now they're all selected. That's really handy. Now, one thing you might notice about the zoom of our screen here, I'll just zoom in here to fill the available space. When you're dealing with something like location and rotation, the values can be quite different. Like here, we've got the top value of 5, but our Y rotation curve is already at 180. So it's quite difficult to fit on our view here. What we can do is normalize the view. What that's going to do is shrink the visual representation of our curves here so that it is normalized between a value of 0 and 1. I'll just need to zoom in now, so I'll just zoom in to show you. So now this is the maximum of our curve here. Its value is 1, but that is just the visual value inside our graph editor. So here you can see if we adjust this, it's not actually 0.5, it's just 0.5 of what it was. So that might make sense so far. Now this button here will actually keep those changes in sync with what's happening in your viewport. I'll show you how that works in a moment. But here's where it gets a little bit confusing. So let's say if I delete this key here and this key here, just by hitting X, you'll see that it's automatically changed this up to the maximum value of 1. And what happens if I move this down? I want you to pay attention to what happens to the curve. It automatically snaps back up. And now the value is actually lower, but it's just normalizing the view each time. Now if I disable the sync here and I do it, you can see that it has lowered the value. And if I turn it back on, it's snapped the maximum of that curve up to a value of 1. But remember that normalizing your view doesn't actually change the value, it just changed the way it's displayed inside your graph editor. So that can be a little bit confusing when you first start out. Now over here on this part of our graph editor is where all our groups are set. You see this little group here, and you can see these channels are actually sitting outside the group. I've done this purposely. Sometimes when you key certain channels together, they'll end up in this group, and then when you go and key another channel outside that, it'll end up outside your group. And what if you wanted to put all of these inside there? Well, you can. All you need to do is make sure that you select all of them. So if I can just hit A with my mouse over this side, and then hit Control G, and then create a new group. So I'm going to call this Object Transforms. And now you see I've got one tidy group. Now if I wanted to move anything up in the order, I just hit page up, move it down with page down. And that's how you handle that. If I wanted to separate some out into a different group, I'll just select them, just shift selecting them there, and then hit Control-Alt-G, and now they're separated from that group. If I wanted to create a new group for that, you already know it's Control-G. New group. And now I have some tidy little groups for all my channels. These little eyes here will make your channels visible or invisible, and the master one here will do all the channels in that group. Obviously, you just saw if you double click, you can rename this. So rename the group. And these little wrench icons, this will disable any modifiers, some curve modifiers. We'll take a look at those later on. This little checkbox will mute any of the channels, and this lockbox will mean that you cannot edit them. You can also select the channels and then hit the Tab key, which will lock any ones that you have selected. Let's just unlock them by hitting Tab again. Right, so if you want to manipulate your keys inside the graph editor, it works exactly the same as any of the other animation editors. You can just hit G and grab it. You can rotate it around. Of course, the default setting will rotate around the cursor. So that's what this little two blue lines are. That is the 2D cursor. We can change that from up here. We have three options: the bounding box center, the 3D cursor, and individual centers. And you can also bring that up with the period key on your keyboard. That will give you the shortcut to bring up that menu. Now, what does that do? Well, let's just say I want to manipulate these ones. I wanted to rotate them, but I don't want to rotate around here. I'm going to hit the period key and bring up individual centers. And now when I rotate them, I'm changing those two keys together. That also works if I want to scale the handles as well. Now, these little buttons here, this little arrow will show you only the selected objects inside your graph editor. So if you have many objects in your scene, it's sometimes handy to filter out the display here to only show you what you're actually working on at that particular moment. Now, this option here will show you any hidden objects. It will include those curves, although it won't work in conjunction with the selected only, because obviously it can't be selected and hidden at the same time. So you won't be able to use those two options together. And this final option will show you any broken animation channels. So we'll go through broken animation channels later in the course. But a good default setting is to have it just on this one here. And then you just focus on actually the object that you have selected. Now this one here is going to turn on your ghost frame. So if I enable that one, you see it's now turned into a little cross. And then I grab this here. Whatever channels that I had selected, it's going to leave a ghost outline of what the old curve looked like. And then if I wanted to get rid of this line, you can just disable that. So now we don't see where it used to be. And here is some more filters. So these three here are the same as those options. But if you don't want to show any meshes or any node trees or things inside your graph editor, you can disable them in the filters here. But chances are you'll probably just leave that at the default setting. Now over here is our snapping. This is going to, by default, snap to the nearest frame. And this is an excellent setting, because when you manipulate these and drag them around, you don't want them to end up on a subframe. Otherwise, you're going to have a little bit of difficulty manipulating the keys. It's going to cause you more problems. So this is a great setting, but you have some other options to choose from here. But you'll find that the nearest frame is the most useful by far. Now, one other cool visual thing that you can do with the graph editor is display the values of our channels over here. We can just go to the view and then go show sliders. And then we can see the handy slider, the values of our sliders here. Now over here on the right side, we have our properties panel, and this gives us extra information about our keyframes. So I have this keyframe selected, and you can see what value it is at. It is at 328 degrees. It exists on frame 53, and these are the left handle. So that's the left handle there. That's the X position and the Y position for that handle. And over here, that is the right side. So that's the X and Y position of that right handle. So let's have a look at our curve modifiers. Down in the modifiers tab, we can actually add extra modifiers to this curve here. So if we wanted to do a cycle modifier, it's going to loop or cycle our animation as many times as we want. We zoom out, it's going to go forever. Of course, you can restrict the frame range, the start and the end. These are all pretty self-explanatory in here. There are some more modifiers. We can delete that one, but for now, let's just show you the noise one, which is obviously quite handy because it creates and generates some noise, so we can actually scale that up, but it works relative to the keyframes that we already have. And I will let you play around with that on your own. Now, don't forget that the wrench icon here will actually disable any of those modifiers that we have on the curves. You can do it on all the channels in the group or just individually. Now there are many ways to add a keyframe inside our graph editor. Now the most common way is by hitting I, and that will bring up your insert keyframe menu. Now it will actually ignore your auto keying set, and it will just say, do you want to key all the channels, only the selected channels? At the moment they are all selected. Or do you want to key the active channel at the cursor? Now the active channel is the last channel that you have selected. So I selected 3 in a row, and the last one is the Z location. That is the one that is active. And you can also key the selected channels at the cursor value. So let me just key all the channels, and now that's keyed that position there. Another way is to manually add them by control clicking. So if I have an active channel that is on the Z channel here, and I can just control click, and that's control left click for me, but by default it will be control right click. And that will add a keyframe at my mouse position. Now there's one thing to note about adding keyframes this way. It only adds it on that one particular channel, the active channel, and it doesn't respect the snapping. So if you actually want it to be on the keyframe and not a subframe, I would suggest you select them. So whoops, this is one there. Just hit G and then 0 and enter. And what that will do, it will shift them to the nearest keyframe without actually changing the values. So you notice that they all shifted slightly, and this one actually pasted over our value that was there because it shifted over the top. So just don't forget, if you control click, it just won't respect the snapping you have set up here. Now deleting a keyframe, just like the other animation editors, you can do that many different ways. You can hit the delete key with them selected, or you can also hit the X key, and that will bring up the same delete menu. If you wanted to delete a whole channel, say let's just delete a whole channel over here, with our mouse over this side of the graph editor and that highlighted there, I can hit X and then just delete that whole channel, and that will work on whatever channels that I have selected. So I want to delete all my location channels, I just hit X, and now all of that animation data is gone. So you just need to be careful in case that wasn't something that you wanted to do. Okay, so now as promised, let's zoom in and take a look at all our different keyframe handle types. So here I am zoomed in on the graph editor. Now it doesn't really matter what this curve represents at the moment. It could be the location of our monkey, it could be the rotation, it doesn't really matter. All I want to do is show you how these keyframe handles work. Well, firstly, I have this keyframe selected. Now I'm going to change the actual handle type by hitting the V key to bring up our handle here. And the first one I'm going to choose is free. And you'll see our color has changed to black, which means that each one of our sides of our handles is independent of the other side. We can grab it and move it and create a sharp point in between our curve here. This is the vector handle type. I'll just select one arm and show you this vector handle. So the first thing you'll notice is that it's now gone green. This is an automatic handle, which means that if we grab our keyframe and move it around, it will actually try and point towards the adjacent keyframe, and that's regardless of whether we move the keyframe or the adjacent keyframe itself. It's always going to try and update that for you. However, one thing to note is if you grab this keyframe and move it, it is no longer a vector. It is changed to black, which means that it's now a free handle type. The aligned handle type acts somewhat like a seesaw or a teeter-totter if you're in Northern America. If we grab one side and move it down, the other side will move up. And if we grab one side and move it out, it will scale independently of the other side. Now, our automatic handle type is an automatic handle which will always try and create a smooth line between our adjacent keyframes. If we move it around, it's always going to try and update to create the smoothest animation possible. And that's regardless of whether we move the keyframe itself or the adjacent key. However, if you try and do any manual manipulation to this keyframe, it's going to change the type. So if I grab this handle and move it, the color has changed. So now it's no longer automatic, it has now become an aligned handle. And finally, our auto clamped handle type, which is the default setting when adding keys inside Blender. This is an automatic handle type, and if we move it around, just like our other automatic handle, it will always try and create a smooth curve. However, it won't create an overshoot if it reaches a maximum peak. Now you'll see what I mean if I change this handle over to the automatic. You can see it's now overshooting. So the automatic clamped will not ever do this. That is the only difference between those two automatic handles. But also, you might have guessed, if you manually manipulate this one, it's going to change the handle type. Now this is an aligned handle. It is not automatic anymore. Now let's have a look at the linear type keyframes. I'm going to bring up my interpolation type menu with the T key and change all of our selected keys to linear. So with this type, we don't need to worry about handles. It's just always going to connect everything in a straight line. And the last keyframe type we're going to look at is the constant or stepped. When we choose this one, there's no change until we get to the next keyframe. So our resulting curve looks like a stair pattern. It's pretty obvious where it gets the name stepped from. Now it can also be called a hold. So that's constant, stepped, or hold. All those names mean the same thing. It's going to hold on the same position until the next keyframe. So before we finish up on this lesson on all our handle types, I want to show you one of the benefits and the downfalls of using the automatic handle. Now, as I said earlier, the automatic handle types will always try and create a smooth curve. Now, this can be beneficial or not, depending on what you're after. So I want you to actually pay attention to what's happening in our curve in this section. When I grab this key and move it, see how it's actually changing our values over here. Now, if you're not prepared for this, this might be something that you don't actually want to happen. And this is because of the handle smoothing type. So by default, it is set to continuous acceleration. If you want to change this effect and just change our whole curve to none, you'll see that by default, the automatic handles are no longer really smooth. There's a kink in this curve here. Although when I grab our little handle down here and do the wiggle, it won't actually do that wiggle past that point. So I'm going to show you a way around that. I'll change it back to the default setting, which is continuous acceleration. Say, for example, I didn't want this area to change at all. I can just change this key here to either be one of the other handle types other than automatic. So I'm going to choose aligned, and now when I wiggle, you'll see that it won't actually go past this handle type because it's no longer automatic. So that is a way to control this. So hopefully that makes sense. I think this is an excellent setting, the continuous acceleration that is, but you just need to know how it's going to affect your curve before you find any nasty surprises. You're like, hey, someone changed my animation. So in this example, I've just added some simple animation. The ball's spinning around 360 degrees and then it stops on frame 25. So what happens if I just wanted this animation to continue rotating forever and ever? Well, we can actually do that with the extrapolation modes. So up here in the channel menu, we've got extrapolation mode. You can see the shortcut is Shift-E, and we have a few options here. Our constant extrapolation is actually what it's on now. This is the default. So, and that means when it hits our last keyframe or our first keyframe, it's going to stick on whatever that last value is. So you can see it just goes off into infinity at that same level. But if we choose extrapolation mode linear, you will see it's going to continue on the tangent that it was on. So now if I play my animation, let's go back to the start and play my animation, it's just going to keep rotating forever and ever. And that's what the extrapolation mode does. Now, of course, that worked because I had it highlighted over here, and that is the same as if I highlighted the keys. It's automatically going to highlight this channel. So it hasn't affected any of these hidden channels over here because they weren't highlighted at the time. So hopefully that makes sense. Now there's only one more thing that I want to mention about this, and that is there's no actual way to have one side of our graph with constant extrapolation and the other side linear, but there is a workaround. Say if we didn't want it to rotate in the negative values here, we can just grab our first value and just repeat it at least one frame before. So let's just drag it back one frame, and you'll see now the tangent is flat, so it's not going to rotate in our negative values, but it will continue rotating forever in the positive values once it gets past our last keyframe. And that is our extrapolation modes. Now out of the box, when you add a new keyframe in Blender, it would always try and use the automatic clamped handle type, but it does have a little bit of smarts to it. Let's take a closer look. So let me just set a keyframe, and this keyframe is auto clamped. I can tell it's auto clamped because we go over here and we can tell it is Bezier auto clamped on both sides of the keyframe here. Now Blender is smart enough to realize that if you change some of the handles, so let me just change our type with the T key and make these linear, and then if you insert a keyframe in between these, it won't actually insert that auto clamped. It's going to look either side and go, if those are linear, you probably want these ones to be linear. And it'll just choose the most appropriate setting. That way, if you want it to work in linear mode, you don't have to set a new key and then change it. Blender is going to do that under the hood for you. Okay, so now we've wrapped up everything you need to know about the graph editor for now. Believe it or not, there is more to know, but as I said, you don't need to know it now. But if anything doesn't make sense right now, when we do some animation, which is in the next video, everything will become clear. So I will see you then. Thanks for watching.